Hello everyone. Today we are going to present Unit 5 conclusion. Ethics and Globalization and Pluralism, New Challenges in Ethics. The lesson outcomes for this topic are 1. Defined what globalization is. 2. Identified moral challenges of globalization. 3. Stated significance of global ethics. 4. Identified positive consequences and negative impact of globalization. Before we start, let's have an exercise first. 4 pictures, 1 word. You have to guess the word that describes the pictures. Well, I guess you got it right. The word is globalization. What is globalization? It is the erosion of national boundaries, reduced significance of national government, moving from a world with borders to without. To elaborate, it is the exchange and merging of individuals, organizations, and governments from other countries. It is fueled by foreign investment and trade and supported by information technology. Globally, societies are affected by this process in terms of the environment, culture, political systems, economic growth and prosperity, and physical well being of people. Globalization is also a process of interaction and integration. The world is becoming increasingly interconnected as a result of technological communication and transportation breakthroughs, which also influence political, cultural, and economic spheres. Nation states will always exist, but they will need to cooperate with other centers of power such as transnational corporations. Some examples of tenses include Apple, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, and Amazon. They all operate in multiple countries around the world. Next is intergovernmental bodies, which refers to an entity created by treaty involving two or more nations to work in good faith on issues of common interest, like the UN, considered as the largest and most familiar intergovernmental organization. Next is the non-governmental organizations or the NGOs. That is a non-profit organization that furthers some social or humanitarian mission around the global like environmental movements. According to Jan Scully, there are 5 different interpretations of globalization. 1. Internationalization. 2. Liberalization. 3. Universalization. 4. Modernization or westernization. And 5. Deterritorialization. Let us know more about these 5 different interpretations. Internationalization. Cross-border relations between countries. Trade, money, and communication are some of many relationships that lead to international interdependence between people and states. Liberalization, open, borderless world economy, is the process of removing trade and foreign exchange restrictions as well as lowering travel obstacles in order to promote an open, borderless world economy and enable participation in global society. Universalization, a synthesis of cultures has taken place, refers to the spread or extension of certain principles, ideas, values, or practices on a global scale. It involves the idea that certain aspects of culture, economics, technology, or governance become increasingly prevalent and applicable worldwide, transcending national or regional boundaries. Modernization or westernization, social structures of modernity. It describes the global expansion of social structures of modernity, such as capitalism, science, media, and music. Deterritorialization. Social space is no longer wholly mapped. defines that in a highly globalized society, social space is no longer entirely delineated in terms of physical places and borders. Businesses and non governmental groups are not limited by regional boundaries. So, what is the reason for globalization? Of course, there are reasons for it. This includes number one, improvements in transportation, number two, freedom of trade, number three, improvements of communications, and number four, labor availability and skills. So first, improvements in transportations. Goods and people can travel more quick. Yes, the cost of moving products between nations has dropped because the construction of larger cargo ships operating on a greater scale can result in a decrease in the cost per item due to economies of scale. Improvements in transportation also allow for faster movement of people and products. Next, freedom of trade. Promote free trade between countries. Organizations such as the World Trade Organization encourage free commerce among nations, contributing to the dismantling of trade barriers. Following improvements of communications, greater communication between people in different countries. The internet and mobile technology have made it possible for people in various nations to communicate more easily with one another. Lastly, labor availability and skills. Advantage of cheaper labor costs, reduced legal restrictions. Nations like India have both high skill levels and cheaper labor costs, about one third of those in the UK. Clothing and other labor intensive businesses might benefit from lower labor costs and less legal limitations in less developed countries. Let us now dig deeper to the historical background of globalization. So the timeline starts with the 20th century lead to the replacement of the police state by a welfare state with state ownership of production and distribution becoming the rule. Then goes to state-controlled command economies were operationalized and nationalization of key industries was undertaken to provide goods and services. State started carrying out several socioeconomic functions. Then several economic models were adopted with the public sector entrusted with control. It was considered necessary to ensure better resource mobilization and to improve public services. The economy and industry were regulated by the state, and the state supported the public sector. However, these models were found to be slow and unproductive, leading to the collapse of socialist economies. In 1990s, the world witnessed the collapse of social economies. As the flaws in every communist economy were exposed, the socialist systems in every socialist nation started to overthrow. Then 1991, states began liberalizing their economies, focusing on principles such as market economy, free trade, deregulation, and delicensing. Every state on the planet has committed to fostering unrestricted trade, businesses, financial, and industrial relations. Let's proceed to the moral challenges of globalization. Cultural influences on moral values, exposure to new ways, global moral consciousness, adapting to a wider worldview, addressing injustice in a globalized world. Basically, the challenge lies in adapting to a wider worldview and developing a global consciousness. For example, the Filipino concept of kami or tayo, which denotes social groups inside the boundaries of a family, barrio, or town, will become a global kami or tayo. The greatest good of the greatest number is the greatest good of the greatest number of the citizens of the world. Global ethics involves growth from local to global moral consciousness, addressing injustice and inequality in a globalized world.
Thank you, Shai, for that wonderful presentation. So I'm gonna wrap up everything and let's talk about global ethics. So global ethics is referred to moral principles and standards that guide human behavior on a worldwide scale, promoting fairness, justice, and cooperation. So globalist ethics talks about more about balance in globalization, but there are some ethical and corresponding consideration that may occur some problems and issue with this ethics. So we need to talk about first the global poverty. In instance, some countries cannot help being poor due to lack of resources and poor governance, whereas other countries have both the satisfaction of governance and wealthy resources. And therefore, poor countries are unlucky since they have disadvantage and they are losing both ends. But in balance equation, a moral obligation of wealthy countries help global poor in some instance, like relief goods and everything like that. So secondly is the migration. So ethical consideration toward rich countries opening doors to individuals coming from the poor area is one of the moral issue of global ethics. It is for the receiving country or the rich country to open the doors for opportunities since some migrants enter to enforce their mission to inflict harm. So next, let's talk about environmental ethics. So environmental ethics talks more about environment since environmental ethics states that they need to protect at least or refrain from damaging the environment. So environmental ethics is all about that. The basis of duty lies in the environment's intrinsic value, its goodness in itself. Nationwide efforts to help address world destruction and prevention to indulge sustainable development and climate change prevention enhancement. So let's talk about next in pluralism and fundamentalism. So pluralism is the affirmation of diversity, which in any aspect of differences, everyone is understood. So no one is not understood in this one. Yet the question to ask in all meetings is what is the moral best for the parties, and in a way it is legal and lawful. So fundamentalism on the other hand is something that talks about religion, that whatever should be yours, yet if you're not with me, then you're against with me. So next, let's talk about its positive consequence of globalization. So let's talk a little bit about that. So the access to wider variety of goods is a very good example of a positive consequence of globalization. Prices maybe become lower, more and better paying jobs, improve health, and higher overall living standards. And globalization is merging historic, distinct, and separate national markets into a huge global marketplace. So people have a huge hands, businessmen have huge hands to accommodate every single business that they could possibly have. And there's no thing such as all pros. So let's talk about it. So the negative impacts of globalization is first, let's talk about the easy access to rich countries. So the rule of less economically developed countries in the world market is mostly to provide the north and west with the cheap labor and raw materials, which mean poor countries and rich country will have the same work done, yet poor countries paid less money, but the rich country paid a lot more bigger. So poor country have less living standards than the rich one. Next is the dependence of transnational corporation. So transnational corporation is something to do with the overall economic developed countries with the guaranteed to the wealth. Okay, so in other words, So there's no guarantee that the wealth from inward investment will benefit the local community. So the often profits are sent back to more economically developed countries where the transnational corporation is being based. So third is the absence of the 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 absence of environmental prevention. Okay, to prevent everything about environments to lose its ends. So the absence of strictly enforced international law means that the TNC may operate in LEDCS, or the less developed countries, in a way that would not allow the more developed countries, and in that sense, okay, they may pollute the environment, run risk with a safety, or impose poor working condition and low wages on local workers, which means that the less developed countries will inflict more about bad environmental preventions, since they have a poor working condition. And how could they impose the environmental regulations if they do have low wages of their own local workers? So next would be the threat to cultural diversity. So globalization is viewed by many as a threat to the world's cultural diversity. It is feared it might drown out local economies, traditions, and language, and simply recast the whole world in the mold of capital Northwest. So yeah, it's simply because, like, for example, Hollywood film is far more likely to be successful than ones made in India or China, which also have the thriving film industry. So we tend to get the one phase of globalization if we mold this one. Like, for example, papers and things like that, dollars. It's more like we unified things, and diversity of each and every one of us is being molded in one thing, which is, for example, the language, we use English, the money, we use dollars, or as what I said, Hollywood film is more likely to be successful than India or China, even though they both give the same effort. Okay, so to wrap up everything, that may be just it, and I'm very thankful to be the last reporter, since I prepare more in some way. So thank you very much, and goodbye, everyone.